Being among critical anthropologists, as I was from very early on in Amsterdam, also implies that people think you are engaged with the ethics of anthropology. And I emphasize that people think this might not be the case, because I always had an ambivalent relationship with anthropological ethics, although I worked a lot on it. But that was partly also because I got some very cogent arguments from Johannes Fabian that ethics should not become more important than epistemology, and that our ethical choices are actually founded on the epistemological conditions that we work with. I still that is still the overarching thought that I have, and I realize that these epistemological conditions include the histories that we inherit, so to speak, including our ethnographic categories, our theories, but also the blind spots. I'll get to that later, but that is, it happened in that way. I guess I was still working on my PhD. Yes. Maybe not. Maybe I just finished. But in any case, I remember that a colleague of mine, Hans Vermeulen, of this Amsterdam department, came to me with the problem that the Dutch organization of sociologists and anthropologists, the NVAS, was considering rewriting its ethical code, and whether I, as a critical anthropologist, shouldn't be interested in that process. And again, I was ambivalent. On the one hand, I didn't feel like that kind of job at all. I still not really happy with those kind of jobs. But on the other hand, of course, I thought somebody has to do this because it might be quite important. And the interesting thing that happened when I was set on these discussions, these were purely Dutch discussions, but with a very postmodern sociologist. He said, we need a postmodern code of ethics. That, to me, to some extent, two things happened that I didn't really like. One was that this postmodern code of ethics somehow seemed more geared towards audience to whom you would sell your knowledge, rather than to the people with whom you would create the knowledge, so with the people you study, which is logical, but that didn't seem to me completely ethical. The other thing was that I increasingly started to doubt the value of codes of ethics, or at least I started to ask questions about them. What do we do with these things? Because basically, in my experience as a critical anthropologist, I had never seen anyone make a serious critical point by using a code of ethics. On the other hand, I knew that one of the most influential ones, right, the Principles of Professional Responsibility set up by the AAA, by the American Anthropological Association in 1971, was closely related to, say, the critical anthropologists that also taught me, the people like Delheims and that whole group of American anthropologists, which also included Bob Schulte, for example. So I participated in those discussions, but I also started to think and read, and of course, since I had been working already on the history of anthropology, I had some sense of anthropologists thinking ethically before anything like an ethical code was there. Because literally, the first ideas about an ethical code really came up only after 1945. And materialized with those discussions, totally, determined by the Vietnam War and the American presence in Cambodia in the late 1960s. So I looked farther back as, that is sort of a methodological instinct that had developed by the time. And that resulted in an essay in current anthropology, my first in current anthropology, which I can tell you is still, it gives you a reputation that maybe even the journal itself doesn't really deserve. Although it has, at that time, it had an excellent editor, Richard Fox. The essay Professions of Duplexity dealt with 4 different phases in which anthropologists had, I thought, different clusters of ethical engagement with their work. The first one was one I was familiar with through the history of the Aborigines Protection Society, which mutated into the society, the Ethnological Society of London. Around it was set up in 1839, and SEL was set up in 1841. Who all seemed convinced of the fact that if only you presented the facts about Aborigines to other people, they would behave ethically towards those people. So they had the ideal, which was not uncommon, and I'm still actually in the process of studying that, for instance, in the context of societies that proclaimed, that wanted to abolish slavery. It was a very strong sentiment around 1800, a little earlier, but also later, that just the facts would have a moral effect, and people would be, as it were, converted to do the right thing by the facts. This was largely the ethos of the Aborigines Protection Society, and it was inherited by the humanitarian side, at least of British anthropology. Interestingly enough, everywhere in Europe the same sentiments were present, but for instance in the French context they were much rarer. What is it, the Sociétés d'Ethnographie, set up by William Edwards earlier in 1837, I think, was, it counted a much larger number of scientific racists who also bought into the ideology of slaveholders in, for instance, the Caribbean. And those accents were very interesting to see, because the slaveholders thought in the same way. We have evidence that black people are incorrigible, right? This is their natural state, and they are better off when they're slaves than when we leave them in the wild, so to speak. Then there was a second phase that was much more informed by actual colonial rule, but not settler colonialism, and including plantation colonialism, but much more, India style, British India style colonialism, where colonial administrators were the first to start to ask for field work. Anthropologists like Edward Tyler and James Fraser were armchair anthropologists. But someone who became president of the Anthropological Institute not so long after Tyler published, or at least Fraser published the first edition of The Golden Bough, was, I'm afraid I can't get to his name at the moment. He was a former colonial administrator who wrote an essay in Man that you shouldn't actually trust the knowledge of these armchair theoreticians because they hadn't been there. And you should have been there. And the consequence was that only then did you possess the ethnographic knowledge, the cultural knowledge that allows you to keep the peace with people. And this whole argument that you prevent wars, cultural wars or race wars, by knowing you're the colonized, was used in, first of all, pleading for an imperial bureau of anthropology, just as the imperial bureau of ethnology in the United States. And secondly, also for a quite radical, more or less socialist attitude towards anthropology as the way to make life bearable for people in colonial rule and under colonial domination. That changed again, and this is where the ethical codes become important. That changed again when, literally professionalism was invented in world sociology, where keeping people to their professions in a decent way, in an ethical way, became important for the medical profession, for the legal profession. And ethical codes and peer review were essential to that process. So that happened somewhere between the two world wars, and it only became important for anthropologists, really important after World War II. And this culminated in the debates between more conservative anthropologists and the critical anthropologists who also protested against the use of anthropology in the Vietnam War and in Mesoamerica, for example. The whole sort of counterinsurgency oriented anthropology. And the critical anthropologists, I think, won the day and then also formulated the principles of professional responsibility with the idea that peer reviewers would hold, that model of peer review and using an ethical code would be applied to anthropology. The difficulty was, of course, that anthropologists, someone who did something wrong couldn't be simply removed from the association because they would still do anthropology. Right? You couldn't forbid someone from doing anthropology by saying that he violated the rules of good ethnographic behavior or something like that. So the whole code turned out largely to be an instrument in internecine warfare between particularly American anthropologists and an extremely feeble instrument which was hardly employed and which also partly explained my original question, why don't we know about these codes in our everyday practice? Because we do our ethics differently. And that developed into, the fourth phase that I actually described in this essay was the postmodern phase, where indeed a very real problem started to emerge in the United States of America, where by that time, that would be around 1985, so late 80s, maybe early 90s, by that time, the majority of people employed as anthropologists were no longer employed by a university. They were in private employ. They worked for companies, for factories, for whatever. The whole range of labor relations where you couldn't simply say, my primary responsibility is towards the people I study. No, their primary responsibility was to their employer. Logical. It's difficult to say something against that. In that context, a lot of these anthropologists said this PPI of 1971, it doesn't work for us anymore. Our paramount responsibility is not towards the people that we study. That was Article 1 of the PPI. So in that context of actually postmodern changes to a model of ethical engagement that was originally meant to be implemented in professional associations with the possibility of sanctioning members, that transformation was the context in which I started to work, and I wrote this essay. Then Dick Fox approached me. I don't know whether it was during a conference or just, in another way. He said, this is such a wonderful essay. I'd like you to consider setting up a conference about ethics in anthropology today, but on the four fields model, right? So not just my own sociocultural anthropology, but also archaeology, linguistic anthropology, and human biology and primatology and associated disciplines. And he proposed that to do so, he would introduce me to Lynn Meskel, an archaeologist whom he had met, who was also very much engaged with ethics in archaeology. And I thought our combination, especially the socio-cultural and the archaeological, would be the best way to start a conference. So I got to know Lynn. We organized that conference. The Wenner-Gren Foundation, of which Dick was also the president, has the comfortable habit of organizing conferences in nice places. So we went to Cabo San Lucas in Mexico, in a hotel where, if you felt bored about intellectual discussions, you could go snorkeling in the Pacific. But with a wonderful crowd of people, some of whom I still work with, also via very different directions. But the result of that was the book Embedding Ethics, which I co-edited with Lynn, which contained essays from both biological anthropologists, and I don't think we got that much contributions from linguistic anthropologists, but there was a strong correspondence, you could say, in thinking about ethics between, say, the more theoretically or philosophically inclined archaeologists and the anthropologists. And a lot, of course, was because of what Jim Clifford, in one of his incomparable books, has called the return of the indigenous, right? That was also the time that people finally started to realize that indigenous is not a term on the way out, so to speak, right? Indigenous peoples are a major force and are culturally recognized globally. And of course that had to have an influence, not least on the archaeologists, many of them were very preoccupied with that. And now one of our conference members was Ian Lilly, who specifically brought in his experience with Aboriginal Australians. And I still am in touch with Ian on related matters, heritage and diversity. Of course, I struck up a relationship with Lynn. We became friends, and we also realized we shared an interest in material culture studies, which is logical because anthropologists can tell archaeologists some things about it, and archaeologists can tell anthropologists a lot about material culture, especially because that is their, way into the societies that they study. So I also joined Lynn in other projects, in other conferences, focused on, which I think she organized, focused on material culture studies, where we congregated with, anthro-archaeologists like Danny Miller, and others, and I think this also resulted in the invitation by Ian Hodder for me to participate in a group of advisors for the Çatalhöyük excavation project in Turkey, which is very famous among archaeologists. Partly because of the background. This was when it was first excavated in the 1960s. This was proclaimed to be the oldest city of humanity. But not only the oldest city, but it was also founded on a cult of a mother goddess, to which the leader of that 1960s excavation, Millard, a British archaeologist of Dutch descent, added the argument that another cult of hunting of the wild bull seemed somewhat subject. In any case, there was talk about matriarchy and stuff like that. That made it immediately famous, a sensation in archaeological circles. It became part of every textbook in archaeology, so to speak. And Ian Hodder reopened that excavation in 1993. And I think it was 2006, I think, that I was invited to take part in a group of advisors that was brought together through money from the Templeton Foundation. We fund religious research into religion, to actually try to kickstart again the interpretation of the archaeological findings in Çatalhöyük, because Ian said at a certain point we felt stuck. We felt there wasn't enough progress being made. And that had a lot to do with the fact that some strange things in relation to this religious aspect happened, because they ceased, in their new excavation, they ceased finding the evidence for this so-called cult of the mother goddess. The statues were almost absent. They did find the big, you know, the horns on the head of the bull, but the other signs seemed to be absent, and or at least they weren't as conspicuous as before. They did find really interesting things, and of course, you know, archaeology is much more. Well, that's maybe not true, but for an anthropologist like me, archaeology was much more driven by technological innovation, and of course, you couldn't compare what people could do in the 1960s with what they can do in the 90s and 2000s, especially as far as computing power is concerned, as far as, you know, the possibility of picturing things is concerned. And so I was lucky enough to spend 9 years in sequence every summer, about 1, sometimes 2 weeks, following the excavation, being explained what they had been finding in that past year by the archaeologists themselves, and then being asked to, you know, help make sense of that. And in the first instance, you know, this was with an extremely renowned group of scholars. It included Robert Bella, it included the French religious science philosopher, now also deceased. Shoot. Well, anyway, I'll get to a certain point. Very famous names, but they turned out to have been appointed by they had been appointed to that advisory group on the request of Templeton. Many of them were so old that they never showed up at the excavation. So we, with the few anthropologists, wonderful Webb Keane and equally wonderful Maurice Bloch, we had a lot of fun together, and we had a very interesting experience there. I'll get to that at another point. But this came out of the whole ethics engagement. I think to come back to that, the engagement, I think, also with Lynn, it partly changed my mind about the role of ethical codes, because you could see that there are situations where an ethical code is really useful, really something you need. If it isn't there, you don't have any authority to fall back upon. And that played an important role later on in what I later described, and that is very recent, it's about 2-3 years ago, described as a new phase in ethical governance in anthropology, but also much wider. And that was all the stuff connected to what we now call data management, right? Everywhere you have laws against, you know, misusing people's privacy. It has a lot to do with the fact that, you know, data are everywhere manageable and misused, you could say, by big companies that you can wonder whether they should be owners of those data. But of course, anthropologists never thought about themselves as gathering data. They thought about themselves as taking part in social relationships and talking to people and, you know, striking up relationships. And research materials, yes, they gathered, but before these could be turned into data on the model of, you know, the digital world, of course that was a whole different issue. And this new phase in ethical governance that I meant to address happened when I was asked to respond to the request of my faculty and my university, by that time in Leiden, to set up a protocol for data management among ethnographers. And I was faced with this difficulty. And ethnography isn't, by definition, gathering data. It's a lot more than that in any case. So we drew up a statement arguing that we start not from the idea of data, but from the idea of the fact that we co-produce knowledge with the people whom are our interlocutors and whose societies we try to understand. That means that we cannot simply transfer the ownership of the data to somebody else because they continue to own it. And in that, I think you see my whole critical anthropological background returning. The idea that, you know, we live from a dialogue, or at least dialectic, in research is crucial there. And luckily, we managed to spread that. This is why this is important in the context of ethical codes, because we could sell that statement not just to fellow anthropologists, but also to our university, and later also wider, as a Leiden statement on data management for anthropologists and ethnographers, with the implication that we have a right to claim that, first of all, our universities don't own our data, and secondly, that we can actually legitimately say, you cannot access my research material because I have a duty towards the people that I study, and my data or my research material is formulated in such a way that it's almost impossible to anonymize, to you know, make it impossible to not to recognize or to, and thereby possibly violate the privacy of the people that you study. And I was very happy. I think that I'm really proud of that accomplishment, also because we did it together. There's several publications in the journal Ethnography, short statements. The European Association of Social Anthropologists has used it in their own statement, official statement on what they think data governance should be. And in fact, I recently heard from one of the staff members of the European Research Council that they adopted the statement to their own ethical guidelines for anthropology and ethnography for ERC projects, ERC-funded projects. So, and this is really, it's been a wonderful collaboration, which is ongoing, right? Especially with another former PhD of Johannes Fabian, Margaret Slayboom-Faulkner in Sussex. We've been able to do a lot in this respect.